Mark Watt, the CEO, co-founder of Whitelion, and it's great to be here tonight and great to see so many people here. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners and the country on Wurundjeri land, part of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge also any elders past and present. It is amazing to be here and so many people here. It's so encouraging for us at Whitelion. Our first Q&A session like this, our first youth justice chat. We really feel that there's so many important things to talk about. Obviously, youth justice, young people that we're working with are in the newspapers for all the wrong reasons, and that, I'm sure we're going to cover that tonight. For those who don't know about Whitelion, we started back in 1999, nearly 20 years ago, and we started out of a youth justice centre in Parkville that operates today, and we started in the file room, by the way, and now we're in 5 states and we've been going for nearly 20 years. We're working with young people between the age of 10 to 25. We work in 5 states. We're working with over 2,500 young people on a casework basis. And for our outreach vehicles in the city, Wyndham, Frankston, other areas, we're connecting with about 20,000 young people a year in one form or another. Obviously, there's a lot of money put into youth justice. Some may argue maybe in the wrong spot. I'm sure you'll find out more about that tonight as well. But I suppose what Whitelion's found out over 20 years is we really believe in certain things. We believe in the value of community with our kids, the importance of community getting involved in young people, and that's why we're so rapt to have 300 community people here tonight. We're also big believers in mentoring, which follows on from community, because a lot of our kids are very isolated, as I said at the start. Very isolated, and we believe in mentoring. We're not sure why the government doesn't support more mentoring programs, but I, for one, would love every young person involved in youth justice to have a mentor. Outreach youth workers, a bit old-fashioned, but I think they're really important to have outreach youth workers working out of hours, weekends, nights, on the streets. And we've got outreach youth workers in a number of places, plus the Chatterbox bus in the city that goes out 5 nights a week. Getting young people a job, we've found at Whitelion, is so important. We see a lot of kids' lives change, and you'll see our fruit to work, our really good coffee. Another enterprise you might see on your seat is Y for Y. It's a pre-employment program. We've got partnerships with Deliveroo, SideTicker, Airtasker, and it's a guaranteed way to get a task, a job, to get employment. So hopefully get involved in that. Now, I could talk about Whitelion programs all night, but I'm not going to, because I know, look at this amazing panel we've got here. They're actually amazing. But I think some of us might get a bit depressed by reading the paper and think, well, can we turn these young people around? Can we change lives? Now, we at Whitelion have found that we do change lives, that we can turn young people's lives around through our employment programs, through our mentoring programs, our social enterprises, and those sorts of things. So please, after this, what we want you all to go away is be ambassadors for young people and be out there talking about them, lifting them up, and getting involved. Now, there is there is a discussion to be had here tonight about whether we lock people up, we support them in the community, all that sort of stuff's going to be covered. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And a guy that's been really involved in the conversation, in fact, reviewing the whole thing, is Professor James Ogloff from the Swinburne University, who, along with Penny Armitage, who knows the system very well, completed their first, or a very big independent review of the youth justice system for the last 16 years. So we're going to welcome James up now to speak about that review. So give James a big hand as he comes up. Now, after James, we've got John Sylvester coming along, and he's going to be moderating the panel, which, as you can see, we've got an amazing panel. And so I'm really looking forward tonight. So thanks, James.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm anxious to hear the panel too, so I'll be fairly brief. I just want to set the stage a bit tonight, talking a bit about the trends in youth justice. And what I want to do is talk about a few things. I want to talk a bit about systems things, but I want to talk about the young people themselves, and I want to try to think about not only what are some of the problems, but potentially what are some of the solutions, and I hope questions tonight will then follow on from that presentation. So just to begin with, I've worked with young offenders for long enough that one of the first young offenders I worked with is now in his early 50s. And how I know that is because somebody wrote to me out of the blue on email. It's easy to find me with a strange name. And he said, "You won't remember me, but here I am living a pretty good life. as now I guess, past middle-aged man. And of course, I did remember him, and it was nice hearing from someone and hearing a success story. So what I want to do tonight is just talk a bit about what we know about youth justice. And I should say, as long as I've worked in youth justice in 3 countries and 6 jurisdictions, almost invariably, year on year on year, the message has been, it's worse now than it's ever been. That, I can tell you that's just not true. So what I want to do is just want to set the stage. So the good news, first of all, is since 2010, we've actually seen the number of cases before our children's courts actually reducing on the criminal side. At the same time, we've seen really good success in diversion and in work police and others are doing. And that approach has really served the state very well over a long time. Now, what we've got faced with then, and Mark alluded to the newspaper, and the very real problem with youth crime, there is a problem, we need to address it, is we've got a paradox. So on one hand, while the number of youth coming into the system has actually been reducing quite considerably over time, and we have good diversion, good community programs, NGOs including Whitelion engaged, on the other hand, what we see is we actually see a rise in the proportion of people who are coming into youth justice who are there for what we call personally injury offenses. So offenses which are of a violent nature. Now this doesn't mean necessarily extreme violence, but it means offenses that have the capacity to cause violence and harm to people. Now, just to give you an example, in 2001, less than 1 out of 3 youth who were in detention or supervision were there for violent offending or these personal injury offenses. When we looked last, it's actually risen now to more than 60%. So that's a doubling over time. Now, the numbers, again, haven't gone up, but the proportion's gone up. So this has created a great challenge for youth justice. How do we deal with this group of people? Now, most young people who are processed by the police don't actually get a sentence later. And if we look at our state, we have about 550,000 people between 10 and 17, so more than 500,000. And when we look at the number of people who are coming into youth justice, it's actually 1.5% of young people are actually given some kind of sentence. And of that group, it's a tiny number that end up coming into detention. But on the other hand, what we see is that of that number, of the small number of people, they're often very responsible or more responsible for a disproportionate number of crimes. So we have this paradox. On one hand, the vast majority of young people, even those who are getting into trouble initially, don't continue on in the justice system. But at the same time, we see a small number of people who are committing sometimes serious offending and sometimes going on to the adult system. So if we look at the adult system, on the other hand, what we'll see is that people in that system who are repeat offending, very often they've had histories that start in youth. So the difficulty for us then is that we need to ensure that we don't ensnare more young people into the justice system who are normal kids, get into trouble, and would normally sort it out. So that's very common in youth, we know that. So we don't want to ensnare additional people in who otherwise wouldn't continue to offend. But at the same time, we have to do a much better job identifying and working with young people who are getting into trouble. And by working with, I mean very broadly, everything from community diversion all the way to, on the most extreme cases, youth detention. And similarly, we have to understand a lot more about the drivers of youth offending. We still don't really understand as much as we need to, in part because it changes all the time. Now, I mentioned I'd speak about the children themselves, the young people about themselves, the young offenders. So these are the sort of more recent statistics. So first of all, they're mostly boys, and that's common across jurisdictions. We have very high rates of contact in the past and ongoing with child protection. In fact, something like 60%, up to 60% of people have a child protection history. This means that they've been identified as being abused or neglected in the child protection system, often prior to coming into youth justice. And at the extreme end, about a third of all young people under order have had out-of-home care orders by the children's court. So they've actually lived out of home as a result of this need for child protection. Similarly, we see almost 70% of them having low academic achievement, and at the same time, we see about half of them have had a history of being expelled or suspended from school, and poor engagement in school. When we look at some of the difficulties people have, about 40% of people have histories of mental illness, and in fact, a third of them are ongoing patients of a public mental health service. So this means they're eligible for and have received or are receiving care in the public mental health system. And that's a very, very high rate, you would agree. When we look at disability, it's difficult to estimate, but the best evidence shows us it's about 11%. So 1 out of 10 with an intellectual disability. And this would compare in the population to less than 1 out of 100 people. So much higher rates of people with disability. And along with that, you've got everything: head injury, acquired brain injury, learning disabilities, language deficits. Now, as probably is obvious, most are substance users, many substance abusers, and a high percentage of the offending is attributed to substance use, either offending while they're using substances or offending in order to get resources to get substances, including, of course, alcohol, which continues to be the most persistent problem. Like other Victorians, about 22% of young people under orders speak English as a second language, and that's pretty consistent with the broader community. In fact, it's a little bit lower than what we see in Victoria. So you can see that as a group of people, the young people are very different from the average young people in society. Now, it's not to say that these characteristics cause them to offend. They don't. Most people who are poor, most people who have a child protection history don't offend. But the combination of characteristics make these people quite vulnerable to end up offending. And incidentally, the ones who go on to do more serious offending often have those more complex histories. Now, there's two thorny issues, I think, that you need to get on the table. The first is the overrepresentation of certain groups of people. And the group that stands out, so if we look over the last 50 or 60 years in Victoria, there's one group of people who have been overrepresented continuously, and things in the last decade have actually been getting slowly worse. And these are our Indigenous youth. So the Indigenous youth are overrepresented, and despite programs, this is something that we have not tackled appropriately or in enough, with any efficiency or with enough efficiency. Now again, the vast majority of people who are Koori and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups don't offend. That's very important. So when we're looking at numbers, we're looking at small numbers, but grossly overrepresented. In fact, it's about 12 times as likely. So if you look at the likelihood that an Indigenous person will have an order, they're about 12 times more likely than other young Victorians. The other thing that happens, and you can tell my accent, I'm not originally from here, I'm a Canadian by birth, but when we look over time in Victoria, there's been waves of immigration that many people here will know a lot more about than I will. And what you often see is disproportionate numbers of people offending in those first and typically second generation of people immigrating. And so in modern times, what we see are overrepresentation of some African youth and youth from Maori and Pacific Islander backgrounds. But again, the numbers are small. So when we did our review, we looked at every single person in the year 2016, and there were 62 people who had an order who were Sudanese. So the numbers are small, but they're disproportionate numbers. And again, it raises issues that need to be addressed. And I can assure people that over time, these numbers will change, and it'll be another group. This is what happens over time with populations. There's a law professor friend of mine who points out that people from his own background, which was a Serbian background, they had overrepresentation of offending. In his generation, there were gangs, and that's essentially gone now. Now, the final group that's important to mention, and I think what's really important, because what happens is in the media and in people's minds, issues get conflated or they get muddled. And what happens is the very small number of people who cause the most difficulty get the most attention. And so what happens is it leaves a lot of people feeling vulnerable, feeling afraid, and of course, people are victimized. So the difficulty is, and it's a great challenge for our youth justice system, is how do we address the offending of a small group of young people who engage in more violent offending of a serious nature. And just to give you an example, 80% of young people who are in the youth justice system over their entire lifetime, so when we look over time, have committed fewer than 10 offenses. So, and the typical pattern is offending when they're young, stopping when they're in late teens or early adulthood, and not offending again. But on the other end, what we see is 5% of people committing more than 30 offenses and less than 1% committing up to 100 offenses. So you have a very small number of people committing a disproportionate number of offenses. And so it makes it very complex for the system, because how do you meet the needs, on one hand, of the disaffected young person who's come into the youth justice system, who has a potential hope for recovery and they won't reoffend, but on the other hand, this recalcitrant, difficult, already violent young person who is going to be much more difficult to work with. So that takes us back to the paradox, right? We have a paradox, because there is good news, and I think the good news gets lost often in the media, because of course the media focuses, rightly so, on things that are newsworthy, and these are often these more sensationalist stories. So there's really good evidence about changing lives. Mark used the word changing lives. And the fact is, most young people who've had contact with police or with youth justice do change their lives. They don't go on to offend, they lead productive lives. So there are three things that we can do to help increase that. The first thing is what we've already done, and Victoria has a good, proud history in our general social and human services around what we call primary intervention and prevention. That is, we have, by world standards, good services for families, good schools, good communities, and good NGOs and good support services. And that needs to continue. So that primary prevention, preventing young people from getting into difficulty. And if they tip their toe in, so if the police come and apprehend them, but they're able to get back on the straight and narrow, they can do that without, again, getting ensnared into the system. And then we have the secondary system, which of course is attempts to try to reduce the frequency of people when they're already offending. And again, there's good news here. So we know from evidence in Victoria, diversion works well. So we look at data, people who are diverted through both pre-adjudication and post-adjudication diversion have lower rates of offending than other young people. So diversion can work well. Similarly, once people are under orders, offender rehabilitation programs, education, employment skills, these sorts of supports that people need. And then finally, of course, tertiary, meaning the most difficult group, how do we provide intervention to them? And this is where I think we've really struggled, and our youth justice system has struggled, because again, it's a system designed originally for a small number of people, most of whom are not committing personal injury offenses. Now what's happened is it's been the number of people, the proportion again, not the number, has actually increased of a more violent group. So that's a great challenge for youth justice and for society. How do we deal with that small group? And for me, just someone who's worked in the field as a clinician and administrator for a long time, although I don't have any administration role here, is of course the sad reality that a small number of people do need enhanced management and control, and sometimes that does mean detention. But it has to be meaningful, productive detention. The worst thing you can do is take a young person, take them away from any supports they have, and put them in and out of youth justice under very toxic conditions. That's one thing I learned in 1982, the first youth justice center I worked at, is if I want to create offenders, I put them in youth justice centers, because the environments are toxic. Now that's sometimes needed because there's some people who are a great risk to public safety, but we need to be very cautious about who we actually incarcerate and under what circumstances. So I just want to close by saying that we need more intensive options and solutions for what I've called the most difficult young offenders, and of course we need to meet their needs. But at the same time, in our review, we cited the review that had been done in the UK just before us. And I just want to end on a paragraph which I think is quite important. So this is from the UK again. It's right that children who break the law are dealt with differently to adults. Children act impulsively, often do not appreciate the consequences of their actions. They're not emotionally developed and may struggle to communicate effectively. But children also have great strengths on which to build and are capable of rapid and extraordinary change. There needs to be a shift in the way society, including central and local government, thinks about youth justice so that we see the child first and the offender second. Offending should not mean forfeiting the right to childhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Just a couple of housekeeping matters. We're going to open the panel very shortly, and then you'll be free to ask some questions. Please keep them brief, and if anyone's abusive, there's no sandwiches for you. This is apparently being streamed on Facebook, and for those people, if you wish to tweet, feel free. I don't know what that means, but feel free to do it anyway. Youth crime, isn't it? It's a real topic of today. So you think back in 1960 there was a huge gang problem, we were told. The bodgies and the widgies. These people did such dastardly things. It was reported on page 1 of one of the papers that there were some bodgies who didn't give up their seat for a pregnant woman on a tram. They were hanging around at dance halls at the time when we had 6 o'clock closing. The Commissioner of the day, Rupert Arnold's response was to say we need to launch some summary justice, which was code for not putting them before the courts but bashing them. And he sent out 1,000 police to take on this menace of the bodgies and widgies. 1,000 police when the police force was about 4,000, so it was 1 in 4 police went out with the purpose of bashing or kicking up the backside some of these young people. The response was that the respect for police in Victoria probably hit an all-time low. 10 years later, we had the moratorium, we had demonstrations, and the Commissioner of the day put his most experienced police out there. Probably a logical thing, but the problem was there was a generational gap as well, which meant that some of those police were 40 years old, 45 years old, some had fought in the Korean War, so they were philosophically opposed to the demonstrators. And there was a lot of violence. The response was a pretty smart fellow by the name of Mick Miller, who was then Assistant Commissioner Operations, actually put his youngest police on the front line so that the generational problem dissipated. And these were people who probably didn't want to go to Vietnam as well. And even though one side had long hair and the other had short hair, there was that connection. It established then that you could actually achieve more through conciliation than confrontation. Today, we have the headlines in my newspaper and others about this massive crime problem. And when the police turn around and say, in fact, the crime rate has dropped or juvenile offences have dropped, it is simply not believed. To disconnect that there is a substantial number of people who are frightened, who are angry, who want change, is to disrespect democracy. There is a problem, a perceived problem, and a real problem. We're lucky to have this sort of a panel, which every person here brings a specific area of expertise, which I think we can all learn from. So, Leanna Buchanan, as the Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People, she's actually been inside the justice system. Leanna, is the system broken?
I think we have had enough evidence emerge in the last 2 years to tell us a lot about it is broken. We've done work at the Commission into how often isolation has been used as sometimes the primary behaviour management tool, into how staff shortages were meaning that whole units of kids were locked down. We've had the work that Jim and Penny Armitage did that talked about how unsophisticated the system is, including and particularly in working with those young people who are more violent, who are really challenging to deal with, both in the community and inside youth justice. We have problems in youth justice centres that in some way reflect the different cultures that you just described. We have some staff who come into youth justice centres thinking they're going to be able to engage with and work with kids in a youth work setting, and others who have a very, very different approach. So I think calling it absolutely broken is a big call, but there is an enormous amount of work needing done. I think what we've seen over the past 2 years is a narrative about kids in youth justice custody saying all of the problems, all of the disturbances, all of the riots, if you're going to call them that, are about bad infrastructure and bad kids. And what we haven't had is a narrative that says, actually, we as the state, we have set up a situation that has facilitated and prompted some of this behaviour. And of course, as a consequence, there has been incredible damage, there has been incredible levels of disruption, and those individual kids have ended up with much longer conviction lists.
Former Chief Commissioner Kel Glare is a man who's, even though he's retired, has kept his passion for policing and community safety. Kel, if I could put you in a time machine and make you Chief Commissioner, 3 things that you'd change.
Good evening, everyone. We've started, in my view, as great as it is to see this forum happening, and everyone here, we've started in the wrong place. In 2015-16, we're told there are 60,000 young people offended. That's appalling. What we need is crime prevention. In 1989, I started the Police in Schools program. Not an original idea. I looked at systems overseas. I put police in schools. The program ran, and in 2004, Monash University released an academic study saying the program, while it had some management issues, was achieving great results in keeping young people out of crime. In 2006, the then Chief Commissioner Christine Nixon abolished the program. I believe that's one of the primary reasons we're having these problems today. I work in the Community Advocacy Alliance with a retired inspector named Ivan Ray. Ivan started the Blue Light Disco movement back in 1973 to provide entertainment for young people in a safe environment and where they could be dropped off, enjoy themselves and not have any problems. Now, the Police in Schools program, and the opposition have already announced that if they are elected in November, they will reintroduce the Police in Schools program, teaches young people not only that they have rights, but they have corresponding obligations and responsibilities. It forges good relationships between police and young people, and that's so very important. And it's an opportunity to actually identify some of those young people who are having problems before they ever offend in the first place and steer them in the right direction. So I don't know about 3 things, but we do really need, in my view, to start getting back to those proactive programs that forge good relationships between police and young people, that give young people the skills to avoid getting into trouble in the first place, to raise their self-esteem and give them alternatives. And I must say that when they do offend, and they are subject to a police diversionary program, which I applaud, great initiative, there has to still be some consequence, and that might be no more than forfeiture of use of the mobile phone for a couple of weeks, or a 6 p.m. curfew for a couple of weeks. But there has to be more than someone being told, you've been naughty, don't do it again. There has to be some actual consequence of that unacceptable behaviour. So I do believe that as great as it is to work on dealing and rehabilitating young offenders, although I've never seen anyone rehabilitated who didn't want to be rehabilitated, then we need to actually go back a step further and get into the crime prevention initiatives, and all of the community has a responsibility for that. So John, it doesn't really answer your question, but that's my view on the subject.
Yeah, there's a number of police who think that sort of intervention works. I know that there's one fellow totally committed to taking at-risk youth to the Kokoda track, and he took some there, and one of the kids got about 100 metres and said, where's the end of the track? It was a long 4 days, let me tell you. Magistrate Jennifer Brown, you've served both. Yeah, you've served both in the magistrates area and as acting president of the Children's Court. Can you tell me the difference between the two?
Yes, good evening, everybody. The Children's Court deals with young people who are aged between 10 and 17 at the time it's alleged they've committed a criminal offence, and we have an act that we're bound to apply, the Children, Youth and Families Act, and in section 362 of that act, that sets out the sentencing requirements when we're sentencing a young person. They vary significantly to the sentencing provisions in the Sentencing Act, which applies to adults. In the adult system, for example, you will see the cameras running backwards when an adult is going in and out of a court. You won't see that in a children's court. One of the reasons for that is that when we sentence children, we look at the individual characteristics of the child and we look at specific deterrence, which is looking at a sentence which will deter that particular child from reoffending. In the adult jurisdiction, there's a principle known as general deterrence, which also applies, and that is to deter other members of the community from committing an offence. So the reason why you have the television cameras is that you'll find out that if an adult has committed an armed robbery and they're sentenced to 8 years jail, the theory of general deterrence is that if you're out there thinking of committing an armed robbery, you'll hear that sentence and you'll be deterred from doing that. The principles in the Children's Court include that we have to have regard to strengthening and preserving the relationship of a child with their family, desirability of allowing a child to live at home, to continue their education, to minimise the stigma from appearing in court, and adopting a sentence which is suitable to this particular child. It also does require us to ensure the child bears responsibility that you were referring to, and the need to protect the community from any person from violent or wrongful acts of the child, and if necessary, the need to deter the child from committing offences in remand centres or detention centres, and that's a more recent initiative. So the sentencing principles are very much premised upon trying, wherever possible, to rehabilitate a child in the community, and that's because, as Professor Ogloff referred, they're not mini adults. Their brains are still developing when they reach 25, and we really want to try to see that if at all possible we can rehabilitate them in the community rather than detaining them. But if necessary, of course, sentences of detention are imposed.
And the media, we're not allowed to report the names of the accused?
Unless there's consent obtained from the President, that's correct, and that's again looking at not wishing to stigmatise children in court.
Well, that's even more important today with social media because there's now that record forever. So, you know, you could be 40 years old and the first thing someone does is Google your name and there it is that you were in the Children's Court 20 years earlier.
And it's true, I once had a work experience student who said, I don't know anybody who's ever appeared in the Children's Court, and she went into Court 8 and saw 2 private schoolboys that she knew very well. So the purpose is to really try to assist rehabilitation wherever it is possible.
Dr. Emma Ryan, as a criminologist, hopefully we've all got an opinion, but you've actually got some empirical evidence on the changing face of youth offending. Tell me, do you think there's a difference between the reality that you see and the community perception?
Oh, very much so, yes. The community perception, of course, is really driven by the type of media that is consumed. And so, you know, from my perspective, particularly from the teaching podium where I teach a lot of young people who are, you know, at university, so most of them have managed to avoid youth detention at that point. But one of the first lessons that we teach our students is that concern about the behaviour of young people is not a new phenomenon. It's something that, you know, philosophers and various social commentators have been talking about for time immemorial. Talking about the youth of today and how they're not behaving in ways that adults would approve of, how they're not replicating social values sufficiently is an age-old story. So, and you mentioned yourself that in the 60s there was a gang problem. Well, I show my students quotes from, you know, 700 before the Common Era when people were talking about the same things. So there's no doubt that the realities of children misbehaving is a timeless factor. It's related to social and cognitive development. It's for certain people also related to social and socio-economic status, to cognitive and neural development, and also to the general proclivity of young people to take risks. And that's something normal and natural. But as you say, certain groups are certainly, their behaviour is focused on by the media to such an extent that it causes what criminologists like to call a moral panic, where the media exaggerates the consequences of young people's behaviour.
Yes, but as the professor pointed out, the game changer, I think, is a small number of extremely violent offences, and the home invasions is a barbecue stopper. People aren't talking about these sort of things and imagining it happening at their house. And in the few victims of this crime that I have met, it is life-altering. People are selling their houses from these circumstances. It is a very, very small class of crimes, but it is really impacting on the whole system and the perception thereof. And no one would know that better than Silva Luca, who, in my view, was an inspiration. A mental health clinician, an African mother who struggled with her own daughter culturally as the shift to Australia and Australian values. She's been working tirelessly with at-risk African youth in the Dandenong area, and she set up a basketball side called the Black Rhinos to try and give people some directions, fully supported by the local police. And when she set it up at Dandenong, the stadium managers were a bit concerned about having a number of these, potentially violent young men there. And in the period that it's been going, I think there's been one infraction, and that was one of the players turned up wearing their away shorts when it was a home game. So, but tell us your journey.
Okay. Firstly, good evening, everyone. Never did I think in my life that I'll be talking to a group of people at Q&A. It is said, experience is the greatest teacher. What I should say, when you hear about young people causing crime from African origin, please look at the causes before you start judging them. Mainly, most of our people, they are suffering from unresolved trauma from country of origin, and even when they come here. I am one of the people who actually suffered unresolved trauma after arriving in Australia. Back in my country, things were okay, but here everything else was a shock. Raising a teenager, losing a baby along the way, going to work, getting discriminated because I had postnatal depression. Then I thought, there's something, because back in my country, when you have a preem baby, the whole village helps you. When you have a teenager who is misbehaving, people will come along and help you. But here, we live a life of individualism. And that is actually causing more problems to our communities. So after I got myself back together, I don't want to talk more into details. I thought of studying mental health so that I could understand what the problem I had when I wasn't feeling well, and also problems I faced with my daughter, intergenerational conflict. So I studied mental health, and that helped me to work into some of the prisons and also tomb assembling. In the prisons, I saw isolated African young people. When you talk to them, they say, no, I don't talk to my parents, I'm so scared. And then the parents again, they are so ashamed. Why is your child in prison? But do you see the gap here now? That if no work is done, that gap cannot be closed. And then I also worked in almost all the hospitals in the metropolitan, private and also public. I saw young kids in child and adolescent. When you take the history, they will say, Mom and Dad don't live together. Dad went back to Africa. We are 7 children in the family. Now, what does your mom do? We are on Centrelink. Now, can you actually think, just to think properly, that there is a problem here? And when problem starts happening in the family, people are not agreeing together, mother and child, where does the child go? On the street. And who do they meet? Young people who have got problems as well. And sometimes I've heard of organized crime. Please don't take me wrong. That's what I have heard. And then young people get into more trouble. So what I wanted to say is we need to find out why people are getting into trouble, especially young people. And when you find the reason, you need to find a solution. So this is what I did. I thought I need to find a platform where young people will meet and then start helping them. The journey started with a young man, I think John Sylvester can say more later, a young man that I helped. And after he got better, and I thought, what else can we do? And said, oh, we need to maybe start sport. And then we started basketball. We founded 15 young kids, men, I should say young men. Some had court issues, some didn't have. In 5 months, it was 60 kids. And today, we have got up to 80 kids and 8 teams. I want to tell you something. Most of these children, those who used to go to jail or to the magistrate in court, they don't go there anymore. It's about understanding their problems and also giving them a platform with a thing that they like and with much support. And this work has been done on voluntary basis. But when people started seeing that what we are doing is good, government started helping us bits and bits. And I'll embarrass you, Gary Holloway. I have seen you. You are in this group. When your shops got robbed, you didn't want a punishment, but you thought of rehabilitation. And you came to us and helped us with some money. All what I can say is, please don't condemn these children. They are victims of circumstances. Look at the problems. Why are they in problem? Try to resolve those problems. And we can make Victoria a better place to be. Thank you.
Lee Tolley, she's put her money where her mouth is by working with the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Aid Service and setting up a specialist Aboriginal children's legal service. She can tell us something of which the professor has already pointed out, that, yeah, we do have a black problem, but it's not African, it's our own, because there's been a spike in Indigenous incarceration repeatedly, the same people being arrested and re-arrested. Have you got any idea why we're going through this spike at this time?
For me, it's really obvious, and it comes from child protection. I think that we're not getting child protection right, and that the youth offending is really just the result of this inadequate system. And I say that because there are two jurisdictions that deal with children. So we've got the family court, that's usually between parents, and then you've got the child protection system, which has Department of Health and Human Services, which are meant to act as model litigants. So in family court, they focus on what are the best interests of the children. These are things like staying with their parents, so that right to be with their parents, their right to not be split from their siblings, child protection and status quo. That's another really important thing. Kids should have a settled sort of a life. So in child protection, particularly in the regions, you might have an Aboriginal family where they might be a set of 5 siblings and they'll be spread across the state. And that's just really detrimental to how that child then grows up. And what we know, and particularly from the Australian Law Reform Commission last year, is that involvement with child protection is so strong. The link between the systems, between child protection and youth offending, is that it's considered a key driver for then becoming adult incarceration. So, and the stats do put this nation to shame. I think, Aboriginal children are 24 times more likely to be locked up, so that's receive a custodial sentence, and they're 7 times more likely to receive child protection services and 10 times more likely to be in out-of-home care. So Whitelion is the first Aboriginal children's legal service to operate. So we're really trying to change that trajectory. So we're working with Aboriginal kids 10 to 17, a grassroots level, to try and get them away from the adult incarceration. But as of August, we don't have any funding. So hopefully someone here is listening that would love to donate, or someone from the state or Commonwealth government. are listening as well. I think we're a really important service and we need the funding.
Thank you. Hayden Bradford, here's a gym buddy of mine. We go to the same suburban gym, and he is the founder of Protect Victoria, which has got how many members now, Hayden? 36,611. So Hayden represents a significant rump within the community who feels that the system is failing, that the police and the courts are not tough enough, and that we have effectively gone soft on crime. Now, the reflection of that is if you read any of the policy notes from the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party and the Labor Party coming into the next election, you'll see that that is the key driver. And most of their policies are about getting tougher on crime. One of the significant events was the appeal against the two women convicted of the assault of the two paramedics. That has had a significant impact on the community because we've got people trying to save lives, and one of those fellows, of course, has had his career ended, and there is a massive pushback. And as a consequence, we're heading down the track of mandatory sentencing from both parties, not from one. Hayden, how do you think the system is broken?
Well, that's not on good. God, where do you want to start? The system is broken everywhere. And it doesn't matter where you look at our judicial system, the system is broken. But I just want to jump back one moment. We're an unfunded group, and we want to stay that way, so we don't want any of your money. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. We started off as a closed Facebook group. We've got over 36,000 members. The reason we're a closed group, we don't want anyone from the United Patriots Front, Reclaim Australia, or any of the other racist groups joining us. We're not a racist group, we're not a hate group, we're not a religious group, we're not a political group, nobody is running for politics. We are a pro-justice group. And we want to see justice actually done. It's been interesting here this afternoon. I love some of these panels because all anybody ever talks about is the offenders. Nobody ever talks about the victim who has been carved up with machetes. Nobody ever talks about these people. And they've been carved up because some punk has been granted bail or a youth corrections order or a community corrections order, as what happened to that person recently who was involved in 5 jewellery heists. They attacked people with sledgehammers and knives. And the guy was involved in 5 of those crimes and got a community corrections order. Now, somewhere along the line, this has to change. I mean, justice has to be seen to be done, no matter what the colour of your skin, right? No matter what the colour of your skin, justice must be seen to be done not only for the community, but also for the victims, and there's your deterrent to youth crime right there. Oh, but justice is not seen done. Our investigations have indicated to us that to actually go to a youth detention centre in Victoria, you must have committed 4 home invasions, you must have committed 4 carjackings, you must have committed 4 business invasions, or you must have committed 4 assaults, or a combination of that. Once you've done that, you will go to a youth justice centre, or holiday camp as they're called. Right? Now, wouldn't it not be a really, really good deterrent that no matter what your age, if you pick up a machete and deliberately carve somebody up after you've thrown a rock through their house to do a home invasion, if you were to serve some punishment the first time round, not waiting until you've done 4? So that's basically what we're about. We just want to see some of the soft on laws, the government soft on crime laws changed, because we must remember that when the Daniel Andrews government was elected in the November of 2014, in the year 2015, you know what they did? They got our bail laws and said, listen, if you're under the age of 18 and you breach bail, we don't care. It is no longer an offence. In the state of Victoria, if you are a thug who commits home invasions, carjackings, etc., to breach bail. As a matter of fact, it's legislated. Hence, you always hear the argument, repeat offenders, youth offenders, etc. We don't offer any deterrence. And I don't know, we've been talking about all of this for now, 4 or 5 years? People have been sitting around in panels like this discussing it, and nobody's actually doing anything about it. And there's a whole pile of good ideas we got, but anyway, John probably wants to ask other people questions, or do you want me to jump in?
No, we'll come back to you. It's
okay,
good
beautiful.
to get a different point of view, and hopefully you'll get out not tarred and feathered.
Probably.
Julie Field, she's a rare breed, a lawyer who actually has her conscience as her guide, working heavily in the pro bono area for the disadvantaged. She's worked in animal rights and she's worked for disadvantaged children. I can guarantee you, if you put the two on YouTube, you know which one's going to get all the hits, and that'd be the sad puppy dog. But Julie, you've worked with kids in detention. What sort of impact does it have on those young offenders?
In my experience, you are putting the hurt children in situations of greater hurt. You're putting the sad children in places of greater sadness. And to me, that's a flawed system. How do you heal that? You don't. I feel that we need to approach crime through humanity and through a human lens. And to do that, you need to look at the source. And the source will be, the source of crime will be complex, but I dare say it will always be suffering. It will be a child who feels divided from their community, fragmented from their community, unheard. It's unheard children. And they're the sad ones. And the only way that we can authentically manage that is by staring at their suffering, not looking away from that suffering, continually glaring at their suffering, listening to them, hearing them through what they say, hearing them through what they don't say, hearing them through their body language, hearing them through what they're suffering and what they're experiencing at home. It is only then that we can truly think about the best way to approach healing them. Incarcerating them is not healing them. And we all want safe community. We all want cohesion. And the only way you get that is by growing children who are strong, who are safe, who belong, who have got good, strong character. And you don't build strong character when you label them, when you incarcerate them and you close your mind and heart and ears to them.
Commander Stuart Bateson is in the Priority Communities Division. I've known Stuart for a long time, and he hasn't always been in that sort of area. He's been at the sharp end of policing, and I'll probably embarrass him by telling you that he is actually a police hero. If you go to the Victoria Police Centre, you'll see his name there on the Valour Award list, where he disarmed an offender who was carrying a gun, smashing into a fence, knocking the fence down as he wrestled with him, only to have a former AFL ruckman who owned the house come out and said, "Hey, mind the fence," rather than jumping in and helping. For those of you who can remember that long ago, the first Underbelly series, the main police character, the actor Roger Corser, was actually based on Stuart, who was in the Piranha Task Force. So actually he has done the hard yards. Stuart, you know that there is a real public appetite for the police to get tough with young offenders. Why don't you do that?
Before I start, can I just thank the Chief Commissioner, former Chief Commissioner, for starting the Blue Light Discos. I have very fond memories of my first kiss under Eastland Shopping Centre. So thank you very much. Look, it's really an interesting one because, like my colleague here, I've had the privilege of speaking to some of the victims of the home evasions that have occurred more recently. It's a crime theme that perhaps we haven't been used to. And when I speak to them, I can see the trauma that have changed their lives. I spoke to one family a year later, they're still all sleeping in one bedroom. So we do need to recognise the great trauma that some of this violent offending is causing. And sometimes I think by not acknowledging that, we do actually drive some of those victims further away from what we really need to do. I also think that in terms of getting tough on crime, my 30 years experience has taught me one thing, and that is that we should keep young people away from detention at all costs. and we should be trying to divert them from going into detention at all costs. And that's really important. There's going to be times when we get to the stage where we do have to do that for the safety of the public and perhaps even the safety of that young person. But before that, we really need to make sure that we divert them from the criminal justice system, because all I've ever seen is them coming out better criminals, more angry, more isolated from their community, more isolated from their education, and certainly much more vulnerable to continue offending. And when we talk about the system, I think that's the big issue that we have. So from my point of view, tough on crime, absolutely, we've got to bring these people before the courts, but I think it's a really difficult position because the answer lies in diverting them from going into those detention centres.
But Stuart, isn't there been a change? You know, traditionally our young offenders went down a path. You know, it was truancy, property crime, theft of a motor car, minor assault, major assault, and there was a chance to intervene at every one of these points. But isn't there a small group of offenders who just sort of come out of the woodwork? They've got no history, and the next thing they're doing a violent home invasion or a run through on a jeweller's. How do we actually intervene before they've done that serious crime?
Well, I think the answer lies in strong communities, and you know this is the challenge for all of us. You know, we when we have young people who feel valued, who feel part, that they've actually got something to contribute, that they're connected to their families, connected to their schools. That's what protects them against this type of offending. When they don't feel that value, when they don't feel that they've got those connections, they're just so vulnerable to being influenced by others. And that's what we've seen lately when, you know, one spate of 4 armed robberies we experienced in the western suburbs late last year were committed by 2 young kids that had never been in trouble with the police.
Magistrate Bowles, what did you think about Hayden's view of his figures of how long it would take to actually get locked up?
Well, I'm obviously not able to comment on individual cases, but we have a hierarchy in terms of sentencing, and he's right, detention is a sentence of last resort. I don't think I do agree. I don't know how he's come to those conclusions, that you do have to do X number. We don't have mandatory sentencing. We look at the individual complexities of each young person. I just wanted to say something about the role of victims, because you raised that you felt we didn't have regard to victims. Victims are able to attend our court, so even though you heard earlier that our proceedings cannot be recorded without an order of the President, anyone's free to come and observe any of the children's court proceedings in our state. It's not a closed court like it is in other states of Australia. Secondly, we have group conferencing. So for offenders that are at that top end of the spectrum where we're looking at a serious order, including detention, group conferencing enables victims to actually meet the offenders, and the evaluations indicate that victims get a lot out of that when they understand often the personal characteristics of the young person, and that it's not this big boogie person who's been stalking them and watching their house before they did the burglary. And if the victim doesn't want to come because they're too traumatised or for lots of other reasons, they can write a letter so that the young person understands the effect of their crime. And that's a very confronting thing for a young person to do, but we know it's a way in which they accept consequences and they understand that it wasn't just a random house or a random car, that they have had an adverse impact on the person who's been so directly affected by their offending. We also have victim impact statements that we have regard to as well. So we often, I wouldn't say often, but in a number of cases we have complainants in sexual offences, for example, who come to court. And I can only talk about how I run my court, but I make a point of giving them a voice in the court and doing the very best I can to make sure the young person understands the implications of their offending.
Hayden, you wanted to say something?
Nothing breaks a victim's heart more when they've seen their kids traumatised, they see their children go to school, and despite being in grade 5 or grade 6, the kids in class will randomly defecate in their pants or urinate in their pants because they're still traumatised from a home invasion that has been conducted. In reference where I got those stats from, that's come from the youth detention centres. I've actually spoken to some of the offenders, some ex-security staff there and some current staff at the youth detention centres. Let me tell you very quickly what happens in our youth detention centres. Nothing. If you get out of bed in the mornings and you make your bed in a youth detention centre, you actually get paid money. You get paid more money if you happen to sweep out your room. You get your breakfast delivered to your unit. There was a young lady not so long ago who was sentenced in court because her number was up, so to speak, and she was told by the judge that she was going to the Parkville Women's Youth Detention Centre. She said, "Thank you, Your Honour. I quite like that place." There is no deterrent to stop youths from offending. You know what we should do? There's a really good show that was on TV the other night and confirmed a number of things that we'd found out when we'd spoken to some Sudanese people, some of the mums. They said, when we try to discipline any of our children, the first thing they do is they pick up the telephone and they call the Department of Health and Human Services. They come around, they remove the kid out of that environment, put them in a house with 3 or 4 other people, give them money, give them clothes, etc., etc., etc. And what do 3 or 4 young boys do? Go out and commit another home invasion. You see, maybe we should be bringing in get rid of our youth detention centres, let's call them boot camps, and let's bring in some of the Sudanese people, the mums and the dads, and let them run them for us. That's in the case of, people from Africa or Sudan, whatever the case may be. But I mean, that just to me makes really, really good sense. What they were basically saying, I think it was on ABC 7:30, that report, if you wanted to sort of research it later on, but what these mums were saying, and they were from the western suburbs of Melbourne, was that we can't discipline our children here in Australia.
Well, Hayden, we've actually got one of those mothers on the panel. So,
beautiful.
So, Selby,
yes, I know. I was talking to her before, yeah.
Your experience in regard to that?
My experience is, I'll go back to Africa. When a young person does something wrong, you go to grandmother, you go to auntie, because they know that child very well. If you remove a child and put them in, what do you call, in care, the people who are looking after these young people, different nationalities, they don't even understand the culture of the child. And if they are having more problems, they'll just go out and do whatever they want to do. But if you have a mother, an auntie, to talk to that child, they'll listen. I tell you what, the young people will look after the basketball boys, black rhinos and peregrine falcons. I do stand up and speak to them. When you go home, this is how you treat your mom. You have got rights, but rights without responsibilities are nothing. So I would say what that Sudanese lady was saying, that can we have a boot camp and maybe we can look after our own children? Maybe this needs to be thought, like people need to think it very clearly and maybe do an experiment and see. Because I have done an experiment with basketball. John, you were there, you saw the kids. Our basketballers are from 2 years old to 35. When a 2-year-old holds a basketball, the ball is bigger than their head. What are we trying to teach them? Discipline, and they listen. Or what I can say, our community, we are suffering. Please understand, the moms are crying, are suffering. I have heard people saying, these women, they don't know how to look after their children. It's wrong. We are victims of circumstances. Please help us.
And the Department of Health and Human Services ought to stay right the hell out of it. Let people...
Hang on, Aidan. It's good that there has been some common ground there. Leanna, you look as though you're about to jump out of your skin. If I can ask you for a comment.
I suppose I just want to bring it back to, I think ultimately we all want the community to be safer. I think ultimately we all want to stop offending. So there's 2 things I'd say. I think we need to pay attention. We do need to pay attention to how victims feel. And we do need to pay attention to fear. and trauma. That is absolutely a reality. But we also have to pay attention to what we know works, what the evidence tells us. And the evidence tells us that particularly when you're working with children and young people, a really tough, punitive approach just doesn't make it any better. The principles around deterrence, to the extent that they work for adults, they certainly don't work for children and adolescents whose brains are still developing, particularly the parts of the brain that are about understanding consequence and taking that into account. It just doesn't work. What we know from all of the evidence is that a really tough, punitive, simplistic kind of approach is just going to make them come out of whatever bit of the justice system they come out of more likely to offend, not less. Now, that's not good for those individual young people, but it's also not good for the broader community. It's also not good, ultimately, for people who've been victimised by them in the past, although I absolutely appreciate they have feelings about it. The other thing that I'd say is anybody who thinks that it's soft inside our youth justice centres doesn't see what I see. I gave evidence a year ago about a couple of things that we see, about restraints that have been poorly applied, about kids that have had limbs broken not once but twice, about the child who one of our visitors, and we have some of our volunteer visitors here tonight, but the child who was seen with blood up the back of their t-shirt. And when asked about it, it was because whenever that entire unit of young children was taken to education or to programs, they were being handcuffed. And this child's cuffs were aggravating their self-harm wounds. There's a simplistic approach to working with kids that is neither humane, but ultimately, and probably most importantly, particularly for people who feel like Hayden, it's not effective. And we have to work out a far, far more effective and humane way to deal with children and young people who offend, who keep them out of the justice system when we can. Doesn't mean we do nothing, but we've got to keep them out. And then if they are ultimately detained, we have to do far, far better at working in a far more sophisticated way with them, a far more intensive way, so that we give them some hope of coming out and not reoffending.
We'll take one quick comment from Kel, and then we're going to open it to the audience.
I'll just tell you a little brief story. When I was a working detective, I went to a house and with a colleague in plain clothes in a plain car. Pulled up outside, went to the door was open. A kid came to the door, could not have been 4 years old, no pants, blue with the cold, took one look at us, turned round, and I'll leave the expletive out for decorum, and yelled out, "Mum, the coppers are here." Now, that kid was doomed to a life of crime, no doubt about that. Some kids don't get any moral and ethical training at home. That's the sad fact of life. The first opportunity we have to intervene, because we don't have an intervention system, is when they start school. If we start educating kids from that time they start school to consider the consequences of their actions and to make sure, as I said before, they not only have rights, they have obligations and responsibilities, but if we start working with them from the time they start school, then we will have a long-term solution to many of these problems. But when I introduced the Police in Schools program, we had a short-term solution to a lot of problems, because in those areas where police were in schools, there was an immediate drop in antisocial behaviour, there was an immediate drop in graffiti, there was an immediate drop in the vandalism around the area, and teachers have told me time and time again that the kids were more respectful and easier to teach. So early intervention has to be the key to turning our problem around. Thank you.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we have to learn culturally. I know Selba has been doing some work in prisons, and she's been telling the prison officers that a sign that can be taken as disrespect, that is, a young offender not looking the person that they're talking to in the eye. In fact, in that culture, it's seen as a massive sign of disrespect to look at an elder. And so while the prison officer might think you're being cheeky or you're not complying with what I want, the kid might be trying to. So we've got to learn from each other. The Chief Commissioner said look, there's 60 or 80 or maybe 100 young offenders, he said, we've lost them. They're in the system, they're going to re-offend and probably get more violent. The skill is to get the next lot and keep them out. There was a lot of talk about how the police would not call Apex, for want of a better term, a gang. And it was seen as politically correct because the offenders were black. The reality was that every time you spoke of Apex, it was a giant recruiting placard, because disenfranchised, powerless young black men saw this as a badge of honour. And they got themselves involved in crimes of envy, which is going to a nice suburb, to a nice house, and breaking in and terrorising a nice family and stealing the car. So there was actually a practical reason for doing so. But enough from me. Anyone with a question?
Hello there. My name is Francis Aqua. I'm a mental health nurse. And the envy of the day is that I actually spent the whole 5 months when the young people were in the Barwon prison. So I have a first-hand knowledge. But I'll start with the gentleman at the end there. I was late in coming this evening because I actually I run my own private practice. It's called Positive Mental Health Program. And I saw 2 young ladies today, 12 years old and 10 years old. And they've been a victim of home invasion. Luckily, the house was not broken into. They didn't get inside the house. But the kid is still traumatized that the mother requested to come and see me today because I've done some work with them. But I had to rush and come here because I like the topic. How do we balance what is happening? And like I said, I work in Barwon during the 5 months, and I've worked in Parkville, and I see them firsthand. But I've been in Australia only 31 years, working in the mental health system. And the system is clearly broken. The system is not helping us. The chief magistrate is here, or acting chief magistrate, he's here too. The problem is we've got an unresolvable problem, which is coming from 2 vast areas. The educational system is not providing enough support for this, and it's not just the African young people. I'll try and make it short. It's not providing support for it's not only the African young people that I see in the detention center, but it's across the board. So
I think I'll stop you there. I think we've got the
okay. So I'll get the question out there.
Good, because the sandwiches are getting
the question is, how do we balance these areas? And I'll go back to my mental health area. The young people come into the detention center. We help them. We treat them with either psychological problem or medication. They go to court. They get bailed the same day. And there's no follow-up. There's no support when they bail. Now, we were in Givilia for the 5 months. We had people coming back not twice, but 3 times.
Right, I can stop you there. Stuart, that's for you, for no good reason. But
I think there is a challenge for especially government departments to work better and share better information. So, there's a lot of work that's happening now across government. For instance, in the areas of Wyndham, Brimbank, Melton and Dandenong, they've started what they are referring to as multi-agency panels, where government agencies come together to provide a much more coordinated response and share information on those offenders that are the highest risk of reoffending. So those sorts of challenges I think can be met when government departments work better together, and we haven't always done that. But I quite agree with you that historically, a young person can leave detention and not have the wraparound services that we would like to see. So I think there is that ability to improve in that regard, and I certainly can see a lot of hard work going across government to achieve that.
And certainly just across the board, there's sort of very few votes in the sort of social welfare network, and not just with young offenders, but adult offenders. The number with acquired brain injuries, mental health issues is staggering, and of course there's nowhere to go, and they end up in prison, and they become a greater danger to the general community. We've had a few comments via social media. Judy Clark is a fan of Kel. We need the Police in Schools program back. Another comment is the magistrates' courts are bogged down with toll invaders rather than criminals. So we're getting some sort of feedback there.
Hello? Yeah. Just listening to the exchange, particularly with Hayden's very emotional comment, and Gillian, was it? And your comment, it was listening to it, I don't hear the listening to each other of these extremes. That Hayden's point, I think, has some validity. Well, sorry, that's put to incorrectly. I hear what he's saying, but I don't hear the people saying to him, look, I hear what you're saying, and here's how I think that can be dealt with. We're hearing a lot about what we're doing for the young offenders, but however, there is a point about the victims, these traumatised people. I don't hear about things like what is in place to help them rehabilitate.
Nothing.
From the act. Well, that's only your view, Hayden. But the point is,
Okay.
I don't believe it's nothing. What you're saying, you believe there's not enough or appropriate.
Well,
Now,
you heard
I'm
that-
interested to hear people on the panel who find Hayden's views jarring, but it's a good point, saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and this is what can be done for them, because we are hearing of all the effort being made to support the youth.
I think that's a really interesting point. Would you like to take it up?
Sure. What I'd like to really point out is that I do hear what Hayden's saying, and it's frustrating for me from a criminological perspective, because speaking about victims and offenders as if they are different groups of people is part of where the dialogue begins to unravel, I believe. As we've pointed out here, a lot of the offenders are indeed victims of some significant trauma at various times. And so that victim-offender dichotomy is a false reality, and it's a false logic. And I think if we reflect on that a little bit more, then we're able to take a more conciliatory position, I guess, towards people who might offend very seriously at times, but who also have experienced very significant trauma.
Julie, your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The children that I spent time with in the criminal justice system, and the most serious offenders were victims, absolutely victims. And they often weren't able to tell you about what had happened to them unless you'd spent significant time with them. And after weeks and weeks, what falls out of their mouth is stories of sexual abuse, is stories of domestic violence, homelessness, severe trauma. They are absolutely the victims in our societies as well. I understand what you say, Hayden, but we just need to remember those that hurt are truly, truly the deeply hurt. So we just need to address why the hurt is there, because throwing blankets and Band-Aids over a wound is not going to heal. It's not going to fix it.
But I don't think that's an excuse. I mean, I did 18 years in the military. I have what's called treatment-resistant depression. I don't go and do home invasions. I don't carve people up with machetes. I don't beat up young kids on the way home from school just to get their phone. So, I mean, I think you're being a little bit unfair there. What I'm saying is that because they suffer and they've seen trauma in their lives, that's no excuse to go out and commit home invasions. I mean, where the hell are we going with this in our judicial system?
I'm not saying it's an excuse to do that at all. I'm just saying, but they're children with, poor impulse control, Their brains are still developing, their responses are still developing, and they've suffered very, very deep trauma often, and they need support and intervention to prevent it. And that's where we have the community coming together to support these children and to make them not feel so divided, to make them feel not so humiliated. You humiliate a child, they will react.
It's interesting, I think, because if you take a little bit of the rhetoric away, the funny thing is everyone's on the same page in that everyone wants the justice system to get better, but we're doing it from different pages on the Melway. Everyone's got a different journey. But everybody is saying that there should be rehabilitation and punishment. And it's just how much you put in this bucket as compared to that bucket. Every member of the panel will accept that there are some young offenders who should lose their freedom, that should be in custody. And Hayden would say that there are some who should not be. It's not a matter of locking everyone up. And it's not about being a bleeding heart liberal or a redneck. And it's not about left or right. It's not about soft or hard. It's about what works. And I can tell you that perhaps if we'd worked better in the 60s with some young offenders, then Russell Street bombing would not have happened. I can say that as a matter of fact. I can tell you that if a young man had found a way to navigate himself out of a sexually abusive relationship, 3 women in Frankston would not have been killed by Paul Charles Denyer. It's not a matter of being soft, it's a matter of being smart. And there should be some people locked up. I had an interesting conversation with a fellow called Jerry Madden, who was a Republican senator from Texas. Now, think of that. A Republican senator from Texas. And he was given the job by the Speaker of running the prison system. And they had plans for an extra 17,000 prisoners and 3 jails. And he was an engineer and a former military man. And he said, I don't know anything about prisons. Give me some direction. And the Speaker said, well, probably if you could stop locking people up, that'd be good. So he got together with a Democrat and they worked through a program. And he broke prisoners up into 3 groups. He said, there are these on this side who will never re-offend. Don't worry too much about them. There are those on this side who will always re-offend. Don't worry too much about them. And then we've got the knuckleheads in the middle who maybe through substance abuse or whatever, we can do something about. So they put forward a program which was going to save millions and millions of dollars. And they got it through the House, not because anyone cared about the offenders, they cared about the money. As a consequence, in the next 8 years, they closed 3 prisons. Dropped the prison population and dropped the crime rate. So we actually need to work on the back of house, which is parole and training programs and youth workers. Not because we care too much about the offenders. You might. I'm actually concerned about the community. And if we can do that, it makes it safer for us. It's absolute self-evident and it's absolute about self-interest. Next question.
My name's Gary Holloway. Selba referred to me before. Some of you probably know I had 2 violent robberies and 1 attempted violent robbery. In all cases, there were black faces seen. And my staff are incredibly traumatised. They don't know I'm here. I don't tell them that I'm doing things like this because they don't even want me to talk to the press or anybody. They just hate reading about it. There's an elephant in the room that hasn't been discussed tonight, and I would like to ask especially Jennifer and Hayden, but anybody else who wants to comment. In terms of deterrence for youth justice, I understand the laws were written in 1991. I've read them from cover to cover, and I understand the reasons why. However, I think we have some things happening at the moment. Maybe it happens with the Serbians and the Vietnamese and everybody else who comes here for the first wave. But when a child who is not a child anymore, an 18-year-old plus, commits an offence, what's wrong with deporting some of them where there is the capacity, where they are not yet citizens, they do have citizenship from another country, and making it known to all of the other kids from the same background and the same cultures that there is a real deterrent, and if they keep going the direction that they're going, they're not going to be very happy. They're possibly even going to die if they go back to Sudan, for example.
I don't think I can comment on policy matters in terms of deportation, but what I can say is there are a large number of predominantly young people who come from different African countries where the parents themselves have taken it upon themselves to have their children sent back for them to try to understand and appreciate the freedoms that they have here. I probably can't say much more than that, given that it's essentially a policy matter in terms of legislative change that would be required. There's one boy I know before our court at the moment who is coming in from an immigration centre and is going to be deported once he's been sentenced. I'm just not familiar enough with the federal legislation which is involved to say very much more than that.
Can I ask that sort of thing could be publicised, John, all the media people? I'd like to see that publicised and become well known, both for the victims, because I know that that's the only thing that would really make them feel happy, my people, and all those young offenders who, as they get a little bit older, might start to think that this isn't going to be a happy life.
I might pick up where Jennifer finished. There's a couple of things I want to say. One is, again, I think it's easy, maybe particularly for us as adults, to overestimate the power of deterrence when actually the reality is when you're talking about 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, the notion that deportation is a possibility, which it is, may have no impact at all. So in terms of the real effect of that, certainly on preventing future offending, it's likely to have no impact at all. As Jennifer said, some young people are being deported in no small numbers. And I do think that is sometimes covered in the media, but not routinely, I agree. But I've read some of the accounts myself, as well as knowing about some of that from the work that we do at the Commission. And then I suppose the final thing that I'd say in terms of the why not, or why not in a blanket sense, and there's probably lots of discussion there. But again, we heard from Selba, some of these families, some of these young people have come from, in fact, most of them, I think, is what Selba said, most of them have come from experiencing incredible torture and trauma and war in their countries, or a variation of those, and to return a young person, a child or a young person, to that environment for what might seem like a serious offence, or what might not even be a serious offence, that to me, as a human being, that seems less than compassionate and less than proper.
We're going to hear from Selba, but I just want to mention something about Gary, because Gary's put forward what you would think is a pretty traditional view of a victim. But without wanting to embarrass you, Gary, Gary also made contact through the former Police Association head, Ron Iddles, wanting to do something. He was put in touch with Selba. He went out and saw her work, and he actually donated several $1,000s. So a victim of what you would call black crime realised rehabilitation was the way to go. I know how wounded he is about his staff, who he cares for a great deal, and to do that, I think, tells you what I was saying. It's not left or right. And when we talk about deportation, we're talking perhaps, and certainly in Gary's case, of the so-called Fagan law. let's not worry too much about the 17 and 15 and 16-year-old, but who is he fencing the material to? Who is making the money out of it? And London to a Brick, they are big grown-up adults. And it began with car thefts, with Middle Eastern crime gangs using African boys to steal the cars, and they were making the money. So let's go after them and let's deport them. Follow the money. Always follow the money. Silver.
I know the world is watching. What I want to say is, where is the belief in rehabilitation that we discussed, Gary? Think of the young man that I helped. Look at his history. If I did not intervene in that young man's life, he would have been in jail, maybe on the list to be deported. I think more money should be invested in rehabilitation. If I could ask in this group, has anyone not committed something serious? I guess very few will say, no, I didn't. But I bet some people, when you were young in this group, you did a lot of naughty things. But because there was no one to put you on the spot and someone cared for you, you are here today. So before we speak to the policymakers, deport these kids, goodness, some were born in Egypt. They were born in Kenya. Will they go to Sudan as a bush? I want to ask a certain question again. How about overnight, a life gets reversed, you become a victim, and they become the lawmakers? Would you be happy to be deported somewhere you don't even know, and there is war and graves? When we talk about this life, think of one thing. We live once, we die once. Think of correcting people. Those who cannot be corrected, yes, maybe, but exhaust your strength in rehabilitation the kids. I'm pleading.
One at the back.
Jennifer, you spoke a little bit about group conferencing, and I'm wondering if any other panellists have any views on how restorative justice practices can be, I guess, adapted, as we're seeing, or adapted to working with young offenders and victims of violent crimes to still be effective?
You're not asking me. I think you're asking the other panellists.
No, it's open to the panel, yeah.
Perhaps I can answer my experience, and I think it's a really tricky one. I think there's some really great hope and promise in that, because often a victim, quite rightly, remembers the incident and the trauma that was caused during that particular incident. But if they get the opportunity and sit down opposite some of the young people that commit these crimes, it may be an opportunity for them to actually look at them and say, actually, they're not as scary as I remember them to be. And they can see that vulnerability. It doesn't work in all circumstances, and I think you have to be really careful about who participates in a conference like that. But I've met many of the victims and many of the young offenders, and some of these young offenders are young kids. Sure the hell they didn't seem like that when they came in someone's house in the middle of the night. But if they get the chance to sit down and perhaps listen to their story, I think there's great hope for a bit of healing for the victims. So for me, I think it's a really promising initiative. I think we just got to be careful about how we go about it, because it won't be beneficial for all victims. But certainly I think it brings in a bit of responsibility and accountability into that young person's life, because they'll see the trauma that was caused.
I might just give a couple of examples if there's time.
Please.
A young boy was trying to steal cars from a local railway station, and he was not successful in stealing the cars, but he was successful in damaging the ignition. And when one of the owners of the cars got off the train, he couldn't drive his car away. And he rang the police, and it took a few hours. for the police to arrive, and eventually a boy was charged and came before me, one of the suburban courts. And I decided it was worth seeing if a group conference could take place. And as I mentioned earlier, some victims attend and some don't. But this elderly gentleman who was the owner of the car, he attended. And what the boy who was trying to steal his car didn't know was that the elderly gentleman had been visiting the city because he had cancer and he'd received treatment. So when he got to his car, all he wanted to do was go home because he was feeling so unwell. So for a young boy to hear that story is much more powerful than me saying to him in court, well, you don't know how your actions impacted on the victim. Face to face, he heard about how unwell the gentleman was. I think how generous he was to give up his time to come and speak to the young boy. And as a result of that conference, and it's called an outcome plan, was agreed upon, where the young person has to commit to doing certain things, which in the view of the people who attend the conference will reduce his risk of reoffending. In that case, the young boy, with the consent of the owner of the vehicle, agreed to go and wash the elderly gentleman's car for the next 6 months. Now, what's lovely about that is that what we were talking about earlier, about forming a connection and actually feeling part of the community, made that boy feel better. He came back to court. Instead of his head down, he was able to indicate to me that he had really understood the impact of his actions. And the amazing thing about that is that we then hope that we don't see the young people back in court again. Unfortunately, he did come back. And I thought, oh no, this is one of the only failures I've ever had in group conferencing. And what he'd done was, when he was walking past a car one day, he decided to take some of the change that was in the front console. But you know what he did? He held onto that change, and he also held onto the CDs that he'd stolen. And 7 days after he'd taken them, he went to the police station and handed them in. When he came before me, he said, I thought back, and I know I did the wrong thing, but I thought about there was another victim and I didn't want there to be another victim. So I think pulling the threads from what a lot of people have said tonight, and I agree with what you say, John, there is actually a lot of commonality. It's not that some of us are seen, I hope, to be hard-hearted towards victims. Nothing could be more difficult than sitting in court and hearing and reading victim impact statements or listening to the victims who come before us and tell us the impact the trauma has had. But if we don't intervene earlier in these young people's lives, if we don't give them a reason to get out of bed every morning, if we don't give them mentors and people who are responsible, because as we've heard tonight, and so many studies bear this out, they're victims themselves of child protection. I don't mean of child protection, but they're in the child protection system because of circumstances way beyond their control, then we really do have to worry about the future of these children. So the group conferencing is an initiative in the children's court, it's not in the adult court, and I could give you story after story of where people who are victims have gone in a very angry way wanting to confront these young people, and then the humanity takes over when they understand this young person and their lives, and equally the young person understands just how important it is to accept consequences for their behaviours.
Another message. Another message via social media. Yes, we do have a youth crime problem brought about by soft judges and magistrates appointed by Labor. I just want to finish on one note, a story of two offenders. It did receive some publicity. Two young African men who didn't know each other but had remarkably similar journeys. Both had come through a violent refugee camp. Both had lived under, virtually in a tent or a humpy for some time before they came to Australia to be looked after by extended family because their own mothers and fathers hadn't come. They went to the same school. They were lucky enough to have a really inspirational teacher who got them involved in sport. They got involved with the local cricket side. One of them was gifted. He became part of the Victorian under-16 and under-18 squad. He volunteered to teach his local language at the primary school. The other boy didn't take that advantage. He became a violent offender. He was repeatedly in trouble. Let's call us the good boy. The good boy suffered a stress fracture of his back. He was dropped from the Victorian cricket side. His dream of becoming a professional cricketer was gone. He went to his mate, the bad boy. The bad boy gave him ice. He took ice, and the bad kid told the good kid, listen, I want you to come with me. We're going to do a robbery. And there's going to be some prostitutes and some money and a hotel room at the end of this. So he did the robbery, which was extremely violent and traumatic. At the end of that, he was told, you need to do one more, which he did in Coburg. But the local shop owners were smart enough to blockade them in, and they were arrested. So these two boys go to jail. Our good boy does everything possible. He's released. He doubles his loading at TAFE College because he wants to complete his qualification if he's jailed. The other lad is still a knucklehead inside and continues to reoffend. The magistrate enables the good boy to have his curfew changed so he could go to cricket training. That magistrate was blasted in the media as being soft. The county court judge enabled that to continue. She was labelled as soft. The kid finished his course. When he goes to court, he has an unprecedented number of recommendations from the youth worker, from his bail officer, from the school, saying what chance this kid has in the future. The judge suspends the matter for 12 months to see how he goes. He gets a job and he becomes a worthwhile member of the community. The other young offender was put before the court and was jailed for 4 years. When the good kid comes back, the judge said, well, you've been clean for 12 months, suspended sentence. She was attacked as being soft on crime. I think it's actually a perfect example. The bad offender goes to jail. The one who could be rehabilitated didn't. If she had complied with public perception and had jailed him, I suspect he would have gone, I'm tarred with that brush. I have no chance in this world, so I may as well be a crook. She did the right thing by the offender. She did a right thing by the victim by jailing the bad one, and she did the right thing by us because she's probably stopped a man from becoming a serious repeat offender. A win-win, but you wouldn't know it by reading the headlines. I'm going to stop now. Mark, I think you're going to close the event. Sorry. One more.
Hello. Hey folks, thank you all for contributing to discussion on healthier, safer communities and opportunities for young people. I think it's fair to say that we're all here, whether speaking, listening or watching, as we care about the dysfunction and harm in our communities and are craving some direction to transform this. $288 million Cherry Creek Supermax prison has been announced, despite the instances of self-harm of kids in our current prisons, of physical, sexual and psychological abuse towards them also. The rates of reoffending and of homelessness from kids exiting youth prisons, and a severe lack of job and recreational opportunities, alternative education services, mental health services, drug and alcohol services, and youth work programs delivered to young people before they offend. My question is, what are some practical ways that those of us in communities, organisations, law, academia, and grassroots groups can begin organising and building enough collective power to prevent this prison and instead advocate for cost-effective, evidence-based investments in communities instead of prisons?
Thank you. Kel, have you got a view on that?
I certainly have a view on that. One of the things you can do in your community is design activities for young people that will keep them occupied So they're not at the loose end. They don't have, just wander around the streets. They have actually constructive things to do. It could be sport, it could be art, it could be music. It's really up to the community to decide, but to engage with young people and give them meaningful activities and give them support from a very early age, and that will make a difference.
I agree with you entirely, but as I said, we need resources to do what you're saying. I work in youth work, and many of us here have some involvement with young people too. I'm also a victim of crime. There are a lot of ideas and there's a lot of passion for people to change this, but we don't have the money. Instead, we've got money to a supermax prison.
I'll be political. If the Andrews government had not wasted something like $1.2 billion not building a road, and diverted that to our criminal justice.
Sorry, can one of the other panellists answer my question that I put forward?
Correct you on one thing. In Australia, we don't send children to prison, right? That's a universal law across all of our states and territories. You have to be aged 19 or over to actually, 18 or over and classed as an adult, because that's what you are if you reach the age of 18 in Australia. You don't go to prison. When young people are sentenced... Sorry? Why is that incorrect? With who? And how old was that person? How old was the person?
Okay,
no, I totally disagree. No.
We can agree to disagree. We can agree to disagree. We've got a question up the back.
Wait, sorry, can someone answer my question?
No, we're going to move on.
No, please.
Here we go. I just wanted to make a comment in response to the gentleman who spoke about visa cancellations. I'm a refugee rights lawyer and I regularly provide advice to people who have had their visas cancelled. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of visa cancellations, particularly of those from African background who have criminal offences and convictions. So people working in the sector are particularly concerned about that. So perhaps it hasn't been widely reported in the media, but we're seeing that as a common trend coming out now. One of the common themes that we're noticing is that people who are getting their visas cancelled were not aware that that was something that could happen to them if they committed offences, and perhaps, as a lady mentioned on the panel, perhaps the threat of deportation may not affect whether someone reoffends, but sometimes it might, and I think that there's perhaps more that the criminal justice system could be doing to work closely with migration sector. Particularly because when people get to this, sometimes the way the criminal justice system is framed, for example, encouraging people to make plea bargains can have serious impact on their migration matters later on down the track. And lastly, I just want to touch on the fact that Australia is a party to international laws and has domestic and international obligations to prevent people being sent to countries where they're facing harm. And we don't have the death penalty here, but effectively sending those people back to countries where they're at war is effectively sentencing them to death. And if we have those obligations and we're not sending people back to those countries, then they're at risk of indefinite detention in Australia, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, doesn't have any kind of rehabilitative impact on these people, exacerbates their mental health issues, isolates them even more from the community, and is also a cost to the taxpayers as well. So I think that's something important that needs to be bared in mind.
Interesting point. And see, there was common ground with Gary, who said we need to publicise that this is a potential consequence of the action. Now, this is definitely the last question, I think. We've got one more? Yep.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tanvi. I work with Department of Justice in recruitment space for Corrections Victoria and Youth Justice. Now, my comment and question is in regards to how the gentleman said about where to really invest our resources. So my thought is coming from the other day, I was in St. Kilda, right there when the youth gang was involved and the entire disruption happened. And the very next week, I was again at St. Kilda Beach, where I saw an inclusive group of kids from different backgrounds playing together, doing some functional kind of training. And the only thought that came to me was probably these are the kids who got that opportunity, and those were the kids who didn't get that opportunity. So for me, it's like, from the government point of view, to send that strong message, and as a community together, can we create those kind of structural programs and platforms for kids from every community to become more inclusive? And probably there's a hesitation from each community, and they stay close at some point, they do. And being a migrant myself, it takes a lot of effort for you to come out and have a say. So going back to that, when we talk about the kids, rather than investing a lot in prisons and detention centers and youth centers, can we go back and invest a little bit more in those, creating those platforms for recreational activities like sports activities, which probably a kid, 4 years old, 6 years old kid will understand much more than a counseling session.
Can I just comment on that and your comment before about what to do? There is no doubt that that is the way forward. There is no doubt that that's how the system will end up needing to be rewritten. And so look at organisations like Just Reinvest, who are looking at calling up the government to pull money out of more prisons and putting more money into the community, supporting the community, that they can support the children in the community. So support Just Reinvest, support those organisations, and also use the power of language. Language we have, it's so powerful. Tell stories, repeat stories, say them again. Make sure people hear what is really going on and why these children really are in need of support. And of course, and also victims of crime. Let's just tell stories and get people talking. Having a strong narrative, a strong dialogue is so important. And I think that's what you guys can do as well.